harassment in the workplace can be really challenging things for any manager or HR professional to have to deal with. So I'm taking a slightly different approach to this video, and I'm actually going to react to a podcast, or 2 podcast episodes that I think are really useful in identifying what bullying and harassment really does look like in the work environment and why it's so challenging for HR and management to have to deal with it, in a hope that this is about not defending HR and explaining why we can't deal with these things, but looking at it from a perspective of how can we get better at dealing with these things. So, quick introduction to me, for those who haven't met me yet, I'm Jenefer, I'm the founder of Helix, and we support businesses with all things HR, people management. Bullying, harassment, really common things, they come up day in, day out, and of course we've got the new legislation around the duty to protect against sexual harassment coming later in 2024, so it's really on topic right now. And the podcast that I'm reacting to is In Sight Exposing Narcissism with Helen Villiers and Katie McKenna, and I have to say, for any HR professional, I think this is a really useful podcast. Although it's not work related, they are talking about it very much from the point of view in most of their podcasts around parental narcissism. These 2 episodes are reflecting on our workplace incidents, and therefore I think it is relevant. It's really important, and the things that they bring up, even outside of the work environment, whether it's parents, whether it's relationships, they do have an impact within the work environment. The same people who are abusing their children, abusing their wives, their husbands, they are at work as well, and how we show up in one relationship is how we show up in all. If you listen to their podcast, you'll know I've just stolen that line from them, so I'm sorry, but I think it is really true, and that's certainly my own personal and work experience around this. I would agree, this is true, and I think it's really important that we are able to identify these behaviours in a work environment and deal with it when we spot it or when it gets reported. So I'm going to dive straight in. So the 2 episodes that I am reflecting on are episode 73, Am I Working with a Narcissist? And episode 97, How Do I Fix Our Friendship? So both of these are about work-related situations. The first one, so episode 73 there I mentioned, is titled, Am I Working with a Narcissist? Now, we don't tend to use the word narcissist in a work environment, and clearly HR professionals cannot diagnose anybody, and I have not yet come across anybody who has revealed in a work environment that they have narcissistic personality disorder. I can't imagine that would ever come up. I can't imagine it's something anyone would come forward and talk about, but if they do, then clearly we'd need to work out a way around that and how to support them as well in the work environment and of course the people around them. However, we do talk about terms like bullying, harassment. These are our legal terms. So harassment is legally defined, as is victimisation. Bullying, not legally defined, although ACAS has a definition, and we do have a duty to protect people, a duty of care to our employees, and that's where protection against bullying would come in. So we tend to use that language when we're in HR, but the reality is the behaviours that Helen and Katie are talking about in their podcast are exactly what we would see in the work environment. These are the behaviours that we need to recognise, and some of them are subtle, they are covert, they are difficult to spot if you're not really aware of them and you don't recognise those behaviours. And this is why I think it's really important that we do get this education, we do understand this language and understand what the behaviours are that we're trying to identify. So yeah, while we wouldn't talk necessarily about narcissism, it's not particularly helpful for us in HR to be diagnosing people, to be labelling people, but we do need to think about it from the point of view of bullying, harassment, victimisation, and actually just good, healthy management and healthy work environments and healthy communication. I think there's a lot to be learnt from their podcasts and indeed their Patreon as well, which is their paid for content and educational content, which again, really, really useful because it drills down more into each of the types of behaviours that we're recognising. And something that they pick up in the podcast is the behaviour is enough. That's all we need. We don't need to define why it's happening. We don't need to diagnose people. We don't need any of these things. We need to know what the behaviour is and whether it's causing harm to people, and in which case we need to deal with it in a work environment. And the reason I really strongly identify that is because the term personality clash I'm going to talk about now comes up often. So when I am giving advice to managers, business owners, often the question will come up, how do we deal with a personality clash? or it'll be there's a personality clash between these two people and we don't know how to resolve it. As somebody in my previous years who had not done this education, had not learned about these behaviours, I would have looked at these situations often as a personality clash. And I can see why managers do, I can see why HR professionals do. Now, when I look at this, very, very rarely are we ever looking at anything that could come even close to a personality clash. There are behaviours that are wrong, sometimes just on one side, sometimes there are behaviours that are wrong on both sides, and we have to look into that as well. But it's not a personality clash. So I would define a personality clash as where two people are disagreeing. It's not a personality clash, actually. It's a disagreement. We can't agree on the way forward in dealing with this thing, or we have a difference of need. So let's say, for example, I like to be really warm and cozy in the office and my colleague likes to be cold, like in the office. There will be a clash of need. So we're both sitting in desks next to each other, the temperature controlled is for the whole room, there's going to be a clash of that need. So there are clashes that happen in the work environment which are genuine. Two people have two different needs, or they have two different views on how to progress something. However, in healthy communication, we would be looking at how do we meet both those needs? How do we support both those people? And we would expect that both those individuals would be taking ownership, accountability of their own part, their own need, their own method and ways of communication, and how they progress that to reach a resolution. Not how do I win this argument? How do I get the temperature to how I want it? I don't care what temperature you want. I want to get the temperature to what I want, and that's what I'm going to do, and that's how I'm going to win. That then is no longer a disagreement between two people that is healthy and can be communicated through to reach a resolution. That is somebody trying to bully somebody else to get their position. And that's why I think it's really important that we take the terminology personality clash out of the situation. If there is a clash, if there's a healthy clash and we need to get agreement, fine, and both parties should be working towards that resolution. If there's not, if one party is working towards winning at all costs, then we've got something that's more along the lines of bullying or harassment. So I think it's really important that we take that out and we look really closely at the behaviours. I think the term personality clash is used to kind of distance ourselves sometimes. As managers, it's actually, I don't want to dig into this. I want to assume that both parties is 50-50, bang their heads together and they'll resolve it, and it's not going to happen. It won't go away, it will continue, and that's certainly my experience. You're going to have to dig in and deal with this, and I know for many managers they'll shy away from that. They don't want to deal with it. And that brings me on to something that's really highlighted in episode 73, and that is how people enable this to happen. So within episode 73, a lot of the issues that are happening, a lot of the comments that are being made are happening within group chats. Not all of them. Listen to the episode. I really strongly recommend that you listen to both these episodes to get the sort of full context of what's being discussed. In episode 73, a lot of the behaviours are happening within group chats, and what this highlights is the need for people to be silent in order for these behaviours to continue. Because it's in a group chat, we can see really clearly who is witnessing these behaviours. Now, there is a subtle difference in this discussion in that within this group chat, there's also other messages being sent privately. Now, people aren't a part of that, so they can't see quite the full picture, but there's certainly enough within the group chats that it's really, really clear that there are people that are enabling this. And this is picked up quite heavily in the episode, and talking about how this enabling supports the behaviours to continue. And it could be enabling, so it could be somebody who, by being silent, is allowing the bullying or the harassment to continue. Or it could be somebody who's actually colluding with it and is on the side of the person who is doing the bullying. This will be controlling behaviours, it'll be belittling behaviours, all of these things. When they're not being picked up, that's enabling. There is no such thing of staying out of abuse, bullying, harassment. There is no such thing. If you've witnessed it, you can't stay out of it, because staying out of it simply means you're enabling it by being silent. And this is really important. I think this is something that in a work environment we really need to be training people on. We've got the Duty to Protect Against Sexual Harassment legislation coming in towards the end of 2024, and this really needs to be part of the training that companies are giving, that silence enables these behaviours, and therefore people need to speak out. That's really crucial. Enabling behaviours may be subconscious, they may be conscious, they may actually be as a result of that person also being manipulated to collude. So we've got a behaviour called triangulation, which again Helen and Katie talk about often, which is where somebody's telling kind of one story to one person, one story to somebody else, and making sure that they create a divide between people so that they're in control of the relationships. And I've put that into they've got a 30-minute episode, I think it is, on their Patreon about what triangulation is. So I've kind of summarised that down into a sentence. But for kind of work environment purposes, I guess that's what we're seeing about triangulation. It's telling different stories to different people in order to sort of divide and conquer, I guess we would call it. So we may have somebody who's also being manipulated into colluding or manipulated into enabling, but we also see kind of people-pleasing type behaviour, conflict avoidant, not wanting to rock the boat. And I see this a lot at both management and business owner level when people are contacting me for advice. And quite often, if I refer back to what I was talking about with personality clashes, quite often this is what's going on here is actually this person, this manager often, but it can be colleagues as well, don't want to get involved in the conflict. They don't want to stand up because they are so afraid of upsetting people. And therefore, they tend to end up people-pleasing, which means that you're saying yes to everybody, probably saying, oh yeah, I agree with you, yeah, that behaviour is really bad over here, and then maybe saying, no, actually it's not that bad, or isn't she? So again, the triangulation can come into that. Often we end up people-pleasing the strongest person because that's actually the person that we need to people-please for our own safety in terms of keeping our jobs, so that can come into it as well. It's often easier to people-please the loudest person. The victim, for want of a better word, may not be speaking up, maybe silent, so there isn't the conflict isn't being created by then. So there's a number of reasons and ways in which we can enable these behaviours, and it's really important again that we understand this and we look at how our own behaviours in this and how we can make sure that we are standing up if we have witnessed it, if we have seen something, and how we provide training for people to overcome these things. But also if you look at like Helen and Katie's podcasts, In Sight Exposing Narcissism, what they're talking about through all of the episodes is how behaviours like people-pleasing are harmful, problematic, but also how they come from our childhood behaviours. So one of the things we'll often reflect on in HR is we're like, okay, we've got somebody here who's not standing up for themselves, or they're not saying no, or they're not saying when they can't meet a deadline or a deadline is unrealistic. We would put them on a communication skills course. That would be the obvious go-to answer, put them on a communication skills course. And actually what we can see through these podcasts and the stories that are being told by Helen and Katie is that these behaviours aren't simply I need to learn the skill. They're often deep rooted. Some of them are trauma responses. And because they are so deep rooted, sticking them on a 1-day communication skills course isn't going to help. It's not going to change the fear of saying no. That is, if that's deep rooted in somebody, it's not simply I don't know how to, or I don't know the best way to put this sentence. It is simply, I am so afraid of doing it, I'm not going to do it. Now, once we start tackling the fear and we start looking at those underlying things, and that's where we're talking about therapy outside of my remit in HR, and hence I say go and listen to their podcasts, because that's what they are therapists, and that's their sphere. Then I can see the benefits of training and providing people with the tools and the ability, what sentences do I use, what words can I use, give people scripts that help them to overcome these things. But if you don't get to the root of the problem, that 1-day training course isn't going to help people. And again, I think it's really important that as managers, as HR professionals, we understand this so that we can provide the right support and we can work out whether or not this can be overcome in the work environment. Having said all that, where I imply that kind of people-pleasing, enabling can come from our own fear of saying no and our own behaviours, There is also a lot that workplace culture can do to help overcome that fear of saying no, that fear of standing up, that fear of having our voice heard. One of the reasons this legislation is coming in this year is because so many people who stand up against harassment, particularly sexual harassment, end up being silenced with settlement agreements. They will raise their voice, they will report what has happened, and it's that person that ends up leaving the business with a settlement agreement which enforces confidentiality, so they can't talk about it. So settlement agreements have resulted in sexual harassment going under the radar, people being silenced for a long time, which means that whereas historically it was very overt sexual harassment in the work environment, we're seeing it much more covert now, much more swept under the carpet, much more not talked about, because so many people have got these gagging clauses within their settlement agreements that stop them talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And this is about your workplace culture. This is not about individuals. This is not about their past, their childhoods, how that impacts them. This is about your workplace culture, because it doesn't matter how healthy I am as an individual. It doesn't matter whether I overcome my fear of saying no and I stand up. If I stand up and realise I'm being silenced, I'm going to leave. And at the end of one of the episodes, I think Helen actually says, you do realise you can leave, you can move on. And I would say that to employees. You don't have to stay in an unhealthy work environment. But to employers, I would say, if you've got people who just leave because the place is unhealthy, because when they stand up and speak, they are being silenced, whether that is through settlement agreements or through being ignored, and they choose to move on, that's on the workplace culture. That's on a culture that enables this behaviour to continue. So we do have to look at it from a workplace culture, as well as doing everything we can to support, encourage people to stand up and have their voice heard and to not have that fear of saying no. Because don't forget, as individuals, losing our job is huge. For most people, they don't have a stockpile of cash, which means that they can just leave a job without finding a new one. Most people need to find something before they can move on. So that does put people in a position where if the fear is losing their job, that may silence people. It may silence while they work out how they're going to get out, how they're going to move on to something else. It's not as simple as just, I'll stand up one day, I'll get my voice heard, and then if it's not heard, I'm going to walk out. For most people, it's not as simple as that, and we have to recognise that. And it's so important that the workplace culture is about encouraging people to stand up and not to enable these behaviours. And that's why we've got legislation coming in. It's why training is going to become so important in terms of supporting people to stand up, in terms of not silencing people, and making sure that management and HR are also trained on what to do when somebody comes and reports these things, because I think that's also really problematic. Which brings me on to a few minutes from episode 73, which I just want to listen to again.
To that too, because we are equal in our partnership, right?
Yeah, so it's the support. No, I fully recognize that. And again, when we're talking about in terms of relationships, how we are in one relationship is how we are in all relationships. And this listener has a relationship with Tim, albeit a working relationship. And you have a relationship with Bob, but I'm so proud of you that you have said that you have avoided him like the plague. But already he's been ramping it up. You've said again in the last 3 weeks, he's niggly, snarky, passive aggressive. And he even sent out an email last week where he mentioned multiple people by name. But this listener's job as a role, like having to write out her name, is abhorrent to him. And this listener has said that she did tell her manager that if Bob is another outburst, that you're going straight to HR. What I would advise you, especially in this working relationship, that you keep note of every single thing, no matter how tiny you think it is. And by the way, I don't think it's a tiny thing that he named everybody else. Yeah, I think it's done with intention. I think it's done to put you down. I think it's done to provoke a reaction out of you. Yeah. Helen, I think you call this dog whistling, don't you? Where it's to really get somebody. I call it goading, where it's absolutely done to get a reaction. It's and prodding at you, and that if you don't react in this moment, that again, that will build again. So I think it's a big thing what he did. And I think that once you keep notes of this, so that you are writing all these things down, because you will forget. A lot of the times in the moment, we think that we won't forget these things, but that you're jotting down date, time, what was said, and even that you're able to go back and get a copy of that, of that email. And that is where you will be empowered then going forward, when you will, and I think it's just a matter of time, when you will have to go to HR.
And that is great advice there about keeping records so that you can go and report these situations. It's not just about memory. It's also that these things on their own can look little. And Katie says about there being the tiny things, and she says it's not tiny, and she's right. But on their own, even reporting these things, and I can talk about this from personal experience, it feels so petty sometimes to be saying these little things. Whereas when we've got the bigger picture, that's really important, because it's all of these things together often that build up that picture. And that's where reporting to HR is an interesting factor. So firstly, a company doesn't have to have a HR department. So there must be a grievance procedure, and it must be really clear to employees who they report their grievances to. So this could be HR, although really it shouldn't be. HR's role is actually there in an advisory capacity. It should be somebody in a management line, a management position. So if the report is about your manager, or your manager's got some involvement, then it needs to go to the management above that. Now, different companies do have different setups and things, so that's why it's really important that those procedures have clearly defined lines of who you report situations to. What's then really important is that those people have the training to be able to recognise the report that they are receiving. And that's often where it falls down. And this is where HR can be really beneficial, and it may be useful to go straight to HR if a manager doesn't have the skill, the understanding to recognise it, and HR should then be able to get involved and redirect it to where it needs to be, but with the understanding. But I am going to come to a bit of defence of HR professionals at this stage, and that is to say that our training does not cover any of this stuff. So I've been in HR for 20 years, got a degree, got a master's degree, not a single bit of this stuff has ever been covered. It's personal experiences, my personal life that has brought me to things like the In Sight podcast, which has then made me reflect back on my work experiences to say, wait, professionally, this is so important. This is many things I'm dealing with, and I see it now when I'm giving advice. I have a client who will contact me, and I immediately spot somebody who is not taking accountability. I immediately spot somebody who is deflecting, where their apology appears fake. And all of that is through learning that I've done, which I came to because of my personal experiences and needing to get that learning from that perspective. So I think it is really important that HR have this learning. I think this education for HR professionals to be able to spot and identify behaviours is absolutely crucial. And I think if we are going to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, we have to make sure people are educated on what these behaviours really look like. They've mentioned their dog whistling, which is where something is done in a way that only the individual hears it and other people don't see it as a problem, usually because of the context and things around it. We need training on that. We need to understand it. And that's something that I think HR professionals, business owners, people managers should be looking at, is in terms of getting this education. And I'd be saying to, if you're in a HR department, if you're in a HR role, get yourself this training and get this training rolled out, because this is how we are going to prevent bullying, harassment. We are going to be able to nip things in the bud when we see them, because earlier I spoke about this behaviour exists because people are silent, because people don't speak out. But for people to be able to speak out, they need to recognise the behaviour. You need to recognise that this is a problem to be able to speak out. If you've experienced those behaviours repeatedly, say growing up, in work environments, you're likely to think this behaviour is normal and therefore not speak out. And that's where silence can come from somebody who is not doing it from any deliberate point of trying to enable behaviour, but from a point of just not recognising it. And I do think that we need to be speaking out. We need this training, and it needs to be something that comes in as part of that duty to protect against sexual harassment later this year, and just wider from a point of view of creating healthy management and healthy cultures within organisations. So a lot of what I've talked about and reflected on is from episode 73, because that one is a really common one. It's something we see all the time, and group chats really do seem to highlight the issues. They're great on one point because everything's documented and written down, but for some reason they do also seem to, I guess they come out because everything's documented and written down. So that's why we're seeing a lot of problems with group chats, and we're seeing, as they're more commonly being used, people are not afraid for some reason often of what they're saying being written down, which again either indicates they don't recognise it's wrong, or they don't care that it's wrong, and therefore they're willing to put it in writing, which I think is a really interesting point as well. But episode 97 talks more about relationships at work, and this is a friendship that develops into a relationship, and then the relationship ends, hence the title around keeping the friendship. And actually, it's not a healthy relationship. If you listen to the episode, it's really clear that it's not a healthy relationship. There's a lot of controlling behaviour going on in that relationship, which should not be happening at work or outside of work. One of the questions that then comes up is around relationship at work policies and whether or not we need those. I don't think that relationship at work policies are useful. One of the big things is as soon as you put a relationship at work policy in banning relationships, then you enable the behaviours that we see in this episode, which is that if somebody wants to get into that relationship, they will. Again, these relationships are often around power and control rather than anything else. So this person doesn't care what the policies state. The person who does care what the policies state, the person who has the most then to fear from breaching a policy, is the victim. Again, I don't like using that term, but the victim in these situations. And if you've got these policies which ban them and somebody has found themselves in a relationship where it is controlling, and then they can't report it because that relationship is banned and they fear the fact that they have breached the policy, I think that's really problematic. So I don't think that a relationship at work policy is needed. There are lots of healthy examples of people who meet and get into relationships at work. There are also lots of examples of relationships at work being very problematic. I mean, in HR, when I used to do internal HR, one of the things I very quickly learned early on in my career is I couldn't even have friendships outside of the HR department because fundamentally you just end up with a clash. At some point, you know something that they want to know, or you witness something you really wish you didn't witness. It causes all sorts of issues. So there's a lot of reasons why relationships at work do create problems, but it's about each of those behaviours. So if a relationship is controlling, if it's manipulative, if it's causing a conflict of interest, if it's causing any kind of abuse or harassment, all of those things can be dealt with under other policies. And they're all behaviours that are wrong, whether or not you are in any kind of relationship with somebody, and whether that relationship is just a pure colleague relationship, a friendship, a relationship that is more intimate, then it doesn't matter what the relationship is. Those behaviours are still wrong, and therefore I think we should focus on those behaviours rather than taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut and putting in a relationship at work policy. So I'm not a fan of relationship at work policies, and I don't think that they are helpful in this situation. In fact, I think they could be harmful to go that far and put a policy in place, albeit there may be things that need to be really clearly laid out around things like conflict of interest and confidentiality and things like that, but that should all be in all your other policies. And then finally, I want to look again at a clip from the podcast, this one actually from 97.
Parental relationship, that the child in that relationship feels obligated to hold the secrets, to not say anything, to not speak bad about their parents, and the parents call that loyalty, but actually that is just, again, to obey them. That's compliance, right?
Yeah.
And you get to talk about how you were treated. You
Definitely.
get to share that. Again, I would just preface that with safe people. Like, yes, in the office that you can say this, but I would just be careful that you're not going into the office and, and shouting, because this person could also turn around and deny it and say that you're making stuff up. But I would definitely approach it with HR. And if you have any people around you, I would absolutely say it to them.
I 100% agree. And the thing is that, because this is triangulation, right? This behavior of keeping you alienated and excluded. And there's a very cynical part of me that is wondering how many other people he's done this to. Because there's got to be a reason he wants it secret.
Wow.
Because I suspect he's been up to this with lots of people in the office. And I would I would hazard a guess that if you go to HR, they're going to.
That's a hell of an insight, and fair play for spotting that. And I think you're absolutely right.
But for me, it always comes down to the gain. What's the gain of the behaviour? You and I talk about this just with the kids. Like what?
Yeah.
So what they're talking about here is the person that is controlling in the relationship has asked for the behaviour not to be talked about, for the relationship not to be talked about. So their guess is, and I agree, they're probably right. He's probably done this before, and therefore he's trying to prevent her going to report it. And that if she goes to HR, if she goes to a manager, then he will deny it. And this happens regularly. In fact, I don't think I've been in a situation where somebody hasn't denied it. The reality is, if we are taking responsibility and accountability for our behaviour and somebody says to us, when you said that, that upset me. When you did that, that upset me. I don't agree with that. We look at ourselves, we take our own accountability, our responsibility for our own behaviours. We don't end up being reported to HR or our managers in these situations. They get resolved between us. When somebody gets to the point of needing to report these things, then that person is not taking accountability, and therefore they're not going to take accountability when it's raised with them by somebody in HR, by a manager. You might get lucky and find that there's somebody within the business that they respect, and they will take information, they will take feedback from that person, but it's unlikely in my experience. This person is likely to deny it. Now, this is where we have an advantage when it comes to employment relationships, in that in terms of dealing with something, we're dealing with balance of probabilities, not beyond reasonable doubt. We know that criminal courts, coercive control and things have really low conviction rates. And part of that is the challenges of beyond reasonable doubt. But in a work environment, we're only dealing with the balance of probabilities. And this is where it's, again, so important that the people doing the investigating, the people doing the disciplinary hearings, and I've got videos that go into details about these, they need to understand these behaviours and recognise these behaviours in order that they can pick up on them and consider that balance of probabilities about what somebody has said. Because also in my experience, when somebody denies these things, there's never anything in it. So it's deflection, it's projection, it's, well, they're sensitive, they're a bit of a stick in the mud kind of reactions, or, oh, but they also did this, or that person did that, trying to get the investigator or the person doing the disciplinary hearing to be on the defensive. And there's never anything concrete they can give us as examples as to why this person would have made up this story about them and why they are the victim in the situation. So it is always something we can break apart, but it's also something that creates a lot of panic, that so many people will come to me, managers will come to me and say, well, I spoke to the individual, but they denied it. So now what do? It's one word against another. It's never clearly one word against another. There's always something in there that from a balance of probability point of view, we can deal with it. And that's something to really bear in mind from an employment law perspective, is that we are dealing with balance of probabilities. And I would say go and check out my videos on disciplinary and indeed my courses on it as well, where I go into this stuff in much more detail, because it is so important that we understand what we can do. If we are going to have work environments that are clear of people like this who want to be bullying, controlling, harassing, victimising, we need to understand these behaviours in order to be able to deal with it. And I would certainly recommend, as a first point of call for any HR professional and indeed any people manager, check out Helen and Katie's In Sight Exposing Narcissism podcast, because it does give really valuable information. And I would recommend their Patreon as well for in-depth understanding of the behaviours and looking at them in a work environment. They're not talking about it from a work environment, and if they did do courses on this for professional environments, I would definitely be recommending those. I haven't yet found better educational resources for a professional environment, so I would definitely say go and check out their podcast and their Patreon. Yeah, slightly different video today, so I hope you found it useful. Do hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get all of my videos. And as you can see today, I do tackle those really tough conversations and how we deal with those tough scenarios that you have to deal with when you're in HR or people management.